Good morning. Thank you for joining us for the panel When a State Trolls. My name is Courtney Radsch. I am the Advocacy Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists. I'm also the author of Cyber Activism and Citizen Journalism in Egypt, Digital Dissidents and Political Change. And I am joined here today. Okay, he's now live streaming our panel as we're live streaming it. We are joined here today by three journalists who have experienced state trolling. We're going to talk about, and before we kind of get into introducing them each, let me talk about what do we mean by state trolling. Trolling means a lot of different things to different people. It can include state-organized and directed and funded campaigns of harassment against journalists and others. Sometimes they're paid. For example, in China, in Venezuela, and elsewhere, they are part of the apparatus of the state. There are cyber troops in some cases. In other cases, they are volunteers, where they are mobilized in a volunteer way and not necessarily paid. This is the case, wow, that's much louder. This is the case, for example, in Israel and the United States, and in some cases where you have both happening, as in Turkey, as in India. When we talk about trolling, we are talking about things like targeted online harassment. We're not just talking about people who leave nasty comments. We're talking about state-organized, state-funded, or just state-inspired or government-inspired trolling. This can include astroturfing. Astroturfing means when you are pretending to create the perception that there is grassroots support and grassroots individual people supporting or countering something else. This is called astroturfing. We see that this is including the idea of trying to drown out or undermine real journalism. So creating discussions about things that are off topic or trying to sow dissent among a population online. It can be an influence campaign. And in some cases, countries, for example, Ecuador, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, have hired public relations firms, in some cases in Western countries, to help them do these influence campaigns and help them decide who should they target, who are the most influential journalists that they should try to silence or undermine their legitimacy. We saw this, for example, with McKinsey, which helped develop a list for Saudi Arabia of the most influential people on social media, including many journalists, who were then able to be subjected to targeted harassment campaigns. It's also trolling can be this idea of trying to increase polarization and disseminate disinformation. So as we talk about trolling, we're talking about many different things. And we have two amazing women up here who are doing journalism in very challenging contexts. And we know that a lot of the online harassment and trolling that comes from individuals as well as straights includes a specific gender dimension in the case of women, where often these trolling campaigns include threats of violence, rape, sexual assault, etc. So there's an even added dimension. And the use of deep fakes or doctored images or doctored profiles to try to create and undermine the profiles of these journalists, and in different contexts, creating photos that put them in positions that can undermine their legitimacy in their societies. And we also know that online harassment, when we're talking about state trolling, it's not just something that happens over here on the internet. There are very real physical implications, and you're going to hear about it from all of the journalists up here today. And we know, for example, that in the cases of some journalists, such as Gauri Lankesh in India and Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, and many others have experienced significant trolling campaigns by state or government before they were murdered. And in fact, the last column that Gauri Lankesh wrote talked about fake news and the challenges there. So now I'd like to open up to have our panelists discuss for a few minutes what they have experienced individually as journalists, why, and a bit more broadly about the context. So Yavuz Baydar is a Turkish journalist currently living in self-imposed exile in Paris. I'm sure all of you know that Turkey is one of the most challenging places to be a journalist and the leading jailer of journalists for 3 years running. So Yavuz is the editor of Ahval, a trilingual news organization. And can you start us off by talking about what you experienced in Turkey and from an institutional perspective, what's happening in Turkey?
Hello, everyone. I am speaking not only in capacity of editor-in-chief for Ahval News Online, but also as the trolls made it, insisted that sort of an agent of Mossad, CIA, and French intelligence service, PKK, and Gülen movement, all combined in one. And that has been going on for as long as we had the Ahval online operational since November 2017. We have been targeted, what I would call, I would use the term astroturfing rather than trolling, but let me say for the simplicity's sake, let me use trolls. In Turkish domain, the trolls are much less than elsewhere. Trolls, i.e., doing it for their own enjoyment, and etc. The astroturfing is very well organized in Turkey. And when we started Ahval News Online, as Courtney mentioned, the number of journalists already in jail were more than 170. But more importantly, and I will come back to this, keep in mind that as of now, approximately 93–94% of the conventional media is under direct or indirect editorial control of the government, rather palace controlled by President Erdogan. This percentage is both IPI's and Freedom House's and Reporters Without Borders findings. This is important. What we did when we started, we emphasized a lot on economy. Our strategy was economy news because we thought, the real opposition to the regime in Turkey will be coming from the economic fact-checking and reporting. And 3 months passed. In February 2018, one person mentioned by name, he's a former repentant of the PKK, turned informer, and he started to troll us as I saw, combined affiliations to various secret agencies, and the emphasis was mainly on CIA and Gülen movement, and then followed by the others. It worked. Then this was followed by a huge army of trollers trying to block us from being on the legal domain, and the pattern developed in terms of 1 week at the end of February to get the prosecutors, or rather the office that controls the digital domain, to act. The reason we found out later through our lawyers that we had started reporting our reports about the son-in-law of President Erdogan, Berat Albayrak. We had 2 very critical reportings about his activity as finance minister, and this proved to be the reason for, after this attack, for having our account banned for the first time. And this pattern continued to roll as the hate campaign continued, demonization, which also developed into a frightening moment for our reporters and a couple of editors stationed in Turkey, one in Kurdish city of Diyarbakir, one in Istanbul, and we were very, very anxious about what would then develop. But so far, it's only on legal, on the level of legality or illegality. We are still banned. We continue to be banned double, triple times in the following summer months. In August, again, 2 reports about the finance minister and 1 interview with the PYD-YPJ commander in Syria, which was telling a lot in detail about the military operations of the incursion blended with the Turkish army and Turkish secret service, etc. So this is the experience that we had. We felt very, very helpless. And we continue to insert our view, how transparent we were, how we worked. Our missionary statement was reasserted various times. We wrote editorials explaining who we are, what we do, etc. But it had a frightening effect. Also, there was an additional element, and I will stop here. In Turkish media environment where polarization and ideological affiliations play a much larger part than any sense of solidarity across the ideological divides, let's say Kemalist press, Kurdish press, Gülenist press, etc. And those who ideologically, let's say, did not like us, I mean, we profiled ourselves as sort of left liberal leaning, inclined media outlet. Those who did not like us on the leftist flank or Kemalist flank, etc., not all but some, they joined this campaign and continued to support and endorse this ongoing smearing campaign. So that's the story that I will end here, but we can.
So it sounds like in Turkey there is both an organized, government-led campaign, but that then inspires additional trolling and piling on that may not be directed by the state. I think that's an interesting dynamic we'll return back to. Caroline, I'm going to go to you. So Caroline Muscat is the editor-in-chief of The Shift in Malta, which is a pretty new news outlet that started in the wake of the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia. And you did a very interesting and frankly really horrifying investigation where you spent 6 months undercover investigating secret Facebook groups run by the ruling party in Malta, where you saw them actively coordinating trolling campaigns against Daphne and other journalists. Can you talk to us about that? Tell us more what you found.
Hi. We set up The Shift about 2 weeks after Daphne Caruana Galizia's brutal assassination because the elimination of one of the few independent voices in the country left a massive, massive gap in our media landscape, where more than 90% of our media is owned by the political parties directly. So we wanted to understand why Daphne Caruana Galizia had become such a target of hate. We had some sense that it was a coordinated campaign, but we had to prove where this was coming from. So what we found is 6 secret and closed Facebook groups that worked in a very, very coordinated manner to target journalists and those critical of the government. Members of these groups included the Prime Minister, the President, members of Parliament, all the aspiring candidates for the party, and the attacks they're ruthless and they are persistent and they are intended to just wear you down. What this led to is the assassination of a journalist. What we then saw is how well these could whip up a cycle of hate within hours. We continued to monitor these groups, found that they were built over 7 years, but when the Labour Party got elected, the function changed. It became more a tool to oppress than to whip up support for the party. These groups are administered and managed by people who work in government ministries. So these are people paid by taxpayers who are literally attacking taxpayers and those fighting for democracy in the country. In sum, that's it.
Thank you. And I think Malta is a pretty unusual case because you've actually been able to prove the link between the government, those in the government, and those out of power. And I think I remember in your reporting that you noted that after you revealed in your investigative pieces that this had happened, the Prime Minister, I believe, left the secret Facebook groups. But this is pretty rare to actually be able to really show definitively the link between those in governmental power and how they are actually creating the memes, creating the campaigns. You know, in Turkey, you don't see that. Now, in India, it's another interesting case because you have the case of Prime Minister Modi, who has been at the forefront of using online campaigns. Just a sec. And actually got assistance from Facebook when he was running for a position in the government prior to becoming prime minister on how to really utilize Facebook for elections. Now he's in power, and we have seen that India has mobilized a serious trolling campaign against the independent press. Now, to my right is Rana Ayyub, who is an independent journalist and former editor of Tehelka. And she has experienced this online trolling in a very personal way, in part because of her investigations into corruption by Modi and others in the ruling party. Can you talk to us more about your experience, Rana?
Hi, my name is Rana Ayyub. I'm an investigative journalist and a writer from India. As I was just pointed out that I'm former political editor of Tehelka. I have been a critic of the ruling dispensation led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his Hindu majority-Aryan government, which has, in the last 5 years, tried to polarize India like never before. In the year 2010, I sent the first serving Home Minister of India, Minister of State, Amit Shah, behind bars for his role in the extrajudicial murder of Muslims under Narendra Modi. As it happens, that man is now the second in command of the ruling dispensation in India. Again, in the same year, 2010, I went undercover to expose the complicity of Prime Minister Narendra Modi in the 2002 genocide of 1,000 Muslims. There were commissions of inquiry and nobody could prove anything. So I decided to go undercover, posing as a girl who hates Muslims, a Hindu nationalist, who studied at the American Film Institute Conservatory. I had about 8 cameras on my body. I was undercover for 8 months. And I managed to elicit the truth from diplomats and officers, which perhaps the commissions of inquiry could not. As it happened, my publication, who I worked for, decided not to publish that investigation, citing political pressure. Most of journalism organizations in India refused to publish my investigation, and I finally self-published a book called Gujarat Files, which I was told would face an injunction by the government. But my government is pretty smart. It knows that an injunction would only lead to people reading more of the book. Most of the media did not cover the content of the book, but word of mouth, because of word of mouth, we are today about 500,000 copies in 17 languages. But there was a price I had to pay for this. Ever since I got Amit Shah behind bars, from that year onwards, I changed close to 40 SIM cards in 1 year. Whenever I'm on television, I get messages on my phone that we are outside the television studio, walk out and we will tell you what we can do to you. The fact that I'm a Muslim, a practicing Muslim at that, in a country like India, in a Hindu majority country like India, does add up to the fact, does add up to the trolling. Each time I do a big investigation, there is I remember I did an investigation on Prime Minister Narendra Modi's closest confidant in an extrajudicial murder. And for the next 3 days, there was a Twitter hashtag Rana Ayyub sex CD. Nobody had a sex CD, but in a patriarchal society like India, that meant a lot, and that meant I dealt with abuses on a daily basis. But I wasn't really ready for what happened last year. One of the leading magazines in India honored me with the Youth Icon of the Year. The next day, there were about fake tweets on social media that said, "I hate India and I hate Indians," which was circulated and was shared by millions of people, including by one of the prominent leaders of the ruling dispensation. Another tweet, fake tweet followed, attributed to me, saying, "I support child rapists in the name of Islam." That tweet went viral, and it was shared by the provincial head of one of the largest state in India, Yogi Adityanath. 2 days later, I was sitting with a friend in a coffee shop, and I got a message, a WhatsApp message from a friend, a professional source from the BJP. And as he said, "I'm going to send you something, but try not to be affected by it." I said, "Why don't you send it to me?" It was a pornographic video, like a 3-minute pornographic video. I could not watch it beyond 3 frames. It had my image morphed in it. I mean, nobody can be really ready for something like this. Nobody can, and I wasn't. I mean, they call me brave, but at that point of time, I wasn't brave. I got a panic attack. I was shifted to a hospital, and within the next 3 hours, screenshots of that porn video was all over the country in most of the mobile phones, including that of my father. If that wasn't enough, by the same evening they doxed me. So they put my number, my address on social media, and one BJP functionary, ruling party functionary, said, "She is against the idea of India, go and gang rape her." And so every 2 minutes there would be a WhatsApp message with the screenshot of the porn video being sent to me and asking for my rate. And that happened for the next 4 or 5 days. I don't think I really had to pay the price, this kind of a price, for the journalism that I believed in. 3 days later, I wrote a piece in the New York Times. There was international outrage. 6 UN special rapporteurs wrote to the Indian government to protect me. But as it happened, it made no difference to the Indian government. In fact, the attacks got worse. Yesterday, when CPJ released a list of 10 journalists who are a threat to press freedom, and I was one among them, I mean, I kind of trolling I received for that, I mean, for bringing infamy to India, I mean, just proves the kind of atmosphere we are facing in India, and the only reason that is happening is because some of us who have a voice, who speak, are opposing Prime Minister Narendra Modi's brazen communal politics, wherein there are lynchings every day on charges of consuming beef, and Muslims are killed on the streets, and those who speak and those who have a voice are trying to be silenced. And if it's a woman, what better than misogyny and a character assassination? So that's the story so far.
Thank you. And, it's not easy to talk about these attacks, and it's not easy to do the reporting here. And I will also bring in the experience in the United States, where it is not directed by the government, but where we have documented at CPJ through our reporting, as have others, that when President Trump has, and other leaders, but particularly the president, has singled out individual journalists as enemies of the people, or pilloried them as fake news, or called on them and singled them out, how that has led to increased attacks on those journalists, both online, but also doxing. You heard this term, many of you might know that, but what that means is putting out personal information, like your phone number, like your address, which can then, of course, lead to the potential for physical threats, which in many cases has happened. And I want to go to this link between the digital and the physical. So all of these countries we're talking about up here, although I think perhaps no longer Turkey, are ostensibly democracies. We can have a debate about that later, but let's take it for a given that there's some level of democracy in these countries, and yet what we're seeing are these really vicious campaigns against journalists who are often reporting on corruption, who are reporting on non-partisan or different partisan or religious issues than those in power. And it seems to me that those end up being one of the most dangerous beats. And we know at CPJ that we systematically track the killings and imprisonment of journalists around the world since 1992, and our data shows that corruption is one of the most dangerous beats to cover. So, Caroline, you have reported on the, what has happened, as you told us about with the attacks against Daphne, but you've also been experiencing a significant number of threats, and this has led to some physical restrictions and impact on your ability to kind of be in your community. Can you talk to us about the impact this has? Tell us about what you're experiencing and what this means for your reporting.
You said before that the Prime Minister left the groups, but he had to be confronted 3 times in Parliament before he reluctantly left, refusing to admit that they were hate groups and they were kind of functioning for the party and government. So nothing has really changed apart from him leaving and the president leaving. The function remains exactly the same, and it's now shifted to others, not only myself. For example, an activist, Tina Orso, held a protest in London at an event that the Prime Minister was visiting. Within hours, her ID card, her identity card, her photo, her family address at the home of her parents' residence was posted onto these groups. It spread within hours like wildfire, spilled onto national media. She was horrified, and obviously the intent is to silence. What I'm experiencing is an association. They're kind of moving, shifting the hate from Daphne onto me. For example, one of the groups had a meme of Daphne's picture saying, we killed one witch disappeared, and then my face saying, and another one's appeared. And beneath it, a government employee writes, then this one deserves a few more bombs. This spills out into every aspect of your life. For example, I've experienced going to a grocery shopping and being kicked out simply for, being critical of Her Joseph, Prime Minister. So it becomes extremely difficult to conduct your life in a normal way. And your only course of action is to fight back as hard as you can and publicize the problem as much as you can. Unfortunately, this creates an atmosphere of fear. So you don't have the solidarity and support that you would expect to have from the public and from the rest of the journalists. People are too scared to speak. So obviously, this tactic is proving to be very effective. And since it's the government that is implementing this, who do you turn to? So this is the problem that we're facing. I mean, in a country where over 5 years we've witnessed a state capture of our institutions, we don't even have the courts to turn to anymore. So literally, you become completely isolated. And there's very few people who insist on doing this job. So at the moment, there's a handful, maybe 5 journalists in Malta who actually do investigative journalism and investigate corruption. The rest are all propagandists. They literally work for the political party in government or the opposition.
And I might just remind the audience that Malta is a member of the European Union. And I think we have some EU people here, and I hope that they're really going to take a look at what's going on in Malta and think about how can they ensure that the code of conduct that is required, the principles of freedom of expression required in the European Union is applied to Malta, and that the journalists who are trying to report safely there are able to, who are trying to report on corruption there are able to do so safely. But this issue about the link with the national media, but also the state capture in the countries that we're looking at, and in many other countries where state trolling is a major issue, there is this state capture of the media. And I think that you could make then the jump that there is also a potential lack of solidarity from other journalists. Can you talk about what's the case in Turkey in terms of this link between the national media amplifying these trolling attacks, and also what has been the impact on you in terms of from the physical dimension? You've left Turkey. Tell us what's going on there.
Okay, in 2 parts. First part is, as Caroline mentioned, I think there are 2 key elements there in order to have somewhat efficient methodology to battle astroturfing or trolls, and lack of the rule of law, proper rule of law, and lack of independent conventional media. play really a negative part on developing combat against these attacks and campaigns. And this is online lynch mobs you are talking about, or what I would call digital special ops in collective special ops forces. What the interesting case in Turkey is, I'm sure we will talk more about how to prevent this thing, is when the conventional media itself turns into a trolling machinery, then you feel helpless. In Turkey, 5% of the media, more or less, remains somewhat independent, although most of it is partisan to the left flank or nationalist flank, anti-government, but still. And as we know, as Wall Street Journal reported 4 years ago, there are more than 6,000 what we call AK trolls, AK meaning AKP party in short. And these forces remain. They have somewhat lost, faded somewhat against. I mean, they are trolling. They are trolling for their own grassroots. We have hard time to measure how effective this is, trolling for their grassroots. But trolling against the independent journalists, particularly those who are investigating corruption, particularly in particular the family of Erdogan, those trollings have somewhat faded, as I say. But
and Yavuz, there's no. I mean, you can't access, for example, the judicial system, right? You don't have any legal avenue to address this, I would assume, in Turkey.
That makes you feel helpless. We tried many times. Our lawyer in Ankara is trying, but hits a wall. They don't even tell the lawyer what we are banned for. They don't do anything about the person that started that triggered the campaign that followed by a trolling army. That means that rule of law is no longer existent. It's a totally dependent judiciary that works for the palace, and this creates a lot of helplessness amongst our independent colleagues in Turkey. Outside, we are feeling somewhat free because we know the ways to convey, to report, to reach the audiences inside Turkey, basically through social media, which we use very efficiently, through podcasts, etc. But this is it's especially hitting hard those who try to maintain somewhat independent activity on digital domain. This is very, very, very tough environment, I would say. Especially when you see that the main newspapers, pro-government newspapers, have at the end almost the entire front page trolling. I mean, they put the words into the main opposition party's leader in his mouth, and then also the entire television, with the exception of 2 channels, are basically acting the same way. Then you have a very, very poisonous environment that's blocking you. That's basically stopping you to conduct your what you have to do professionally.
So let me ask you, Rana, does that sound similar to what's happening in India? What's the level of participation by the nationalist media? I mean, you do have a lot of independent media, but also are there any legal options in India to pursue justice to restrict this type of trolling?
Well, I don't think at this point of time we have any legal recourse to this, because I remember I wrote to Facebook and Twitter, and they said that porn video does not violate the Twitter policy. I mean, if that does not, I don't know what does. I appeared in front of the magistrate, gave details of the pornographic video. Nothing happened. I've been following it for the last 1 year. When I went to the cops to register the case, they asked me to see the porn video, which was made. And then there were 3 of them, 3 male constables, and they were laughing and they were smiling. And you sit there and you wonder if this is what can happen to a journalist who's pretty well known. Imagine what if somebody who does not have the influence, if she goes to file a complaint like this. And one important point that I certainly need to make, Courtney, is that, we often say that, oh, this is just online trolling. This is not just online trolling. This also goes offline. My friend Gauri Lankesh, who was killed in 2017, she was killed exactly 1 month after she translated my book in a regional language. Clearly, they can't target me because I'm a bit of a public figure, but they could target somebody like her. And the cops have still not been able to arrest Gauri Lankesh's killers. Just about 6 months ago, somebody in the intelligence agency, he met me, he's a friend of mine, he's a source, he gave me a list. And the list, there were 2 pages each for each family member of mine. The first 4 pages were dedicated to me. What sectors do I fly? What visas have I applied? What school does my niece go to? What time does my father go for his morning walk? Where does my brother work? These are the kind of details. And it does not stop at that. Very recently, I was in Geneva to speak at the UN about human rights violations in India. The evening that I spoke, my bag was stolen with my passport and everything else, and I was shattered because I had a flight the next morning. I went to the Indian embassy. I complained. They said, we will give you a travel card. Just when I was getting the documents ready, I get a call from the hotel that I was staying in that your passport and everything is back in the hotel. Now I wonder, there was no way anybody could know what hotel was staying in because there's no detail in the bag. So clearly, it was a way of intimidating people, even when you are traveling in a different country. When you're talking about the nationalist media, well, the nationalist media has already has demonized us. It has, I remember one Hindi news channel in India, regional language news channel, did an entire 20-minute segment on how I am bringing infamy to the country by approaching the UN. So and they are publishing, that the fake news about me endorsing child rapists was actually carried by a news channel. So you can imagine how it gets amplified. And this, again, I'll come to the fact, this is leading to a possible violence and a possible lynch mob. The other day I was standing in an immigration queue and the gentleman standing in front of me turned and he came this close to me and said, dare you critique our Prime Minister again? And there are, of course, often references made to me that, why don't you go to Pakistan? What are you guys doing here? Because I'm a Muslim, right? So I have no legitimate right to be in India. So this is how, this is not just about online trolling. This has now become a part of our routine daily life, our personal life. And this is the price we are paying for the journalism that we desire to do.
Thank you. We've also, a colleague of mine just put out something about journalists here in Italy who are covering the migrant crisis and how they are getting massively trolled online and also facing threats. So we're seeing this across the board. I'm going to do one more round because I want to hear from each of you about, given that there are really limited legal mechanisms in your countries and in so many of the countries that we're talking about where this is a problem, I think we need to look to the platforms, and I want to hear from you what you think the platforms could be doing. And then I'm going to open it up to questions. So I'm going to ask whoever has the microphone, if you want to ask a question, raise your hand now, get a microphone to them, and then we're going to take 2 at a time. But first I'm going to go along here. So Yavuz, what should the platforms be doing, especially in these countries where you're not going to find a solution when the state and the government is involved in the problem?
Platforms meaning?
Like the social media platforms, the internet platforms, the platforms who in many cases are based in countries with democratic mechanisms, due process, and some ability to potentially seek solutions.
This is mainly a domestic problem in our cases. If you make a distinction between international platforms and national platforms, I think I see much more importance emphasized on the domestic platforms that may help battle these campaigns and attacks and lynching online. We had an experiment with what's called Tate.org, which continues as of today with the help of Facebook. But they have also made some major mistakes lately in terms of working with the AKP municipality in greater municipality of Istanbul, when the Women's March, as you may remember, very powerful Women's March in March 8, which was accused of shouting and screaming when the night prayers were heard throughout Istanbul, and Erdogan and many other ministers accused women of protesting, whistling against these prayers from the minarets, and this was something. This led to a huge trolling campaign, and Tate.org did something that was criticized by the opposition, trying to prove that these whistlings were not really against the prayers. And many people thought that this was out of their turf. They shouldn't have done that, because it was very clear that this demonstration was out there, and no matter what, there were music concerts out there, etc. The prayers will always be there, but nobody protests that. In any case, they lost some credibility, in short. And what we may expect is, in terms of international platforms, is something developing Google fact-checking. And this is something that we wait for in terms of in the Turkish environment. I think that this will be a very positive step forward when we have fact-checking from Google. Then we can engage diaspora media, as we call it, or exile media, and also domestic independent media outlets, small ones, together with the help of this platform. Other than that, we feel quite helpless at the moment.
Thank you, Yavuz. Rana, same question to you. What can and should the platforms do? And obviously, you tried to get that pornographic video taken down. They didn't. What more should they be doing? What would your recommendations be?
I mean, as recently as yesterday, Courtney, or actually day before, I was trying to post a Facebook post on Narendra Modi, and I couldn't post it. And I tried to reach out to the Facebook, to the officials, and and they said that but that's critical of the Narendra Modi dispensation. You don't know if that's the situation. What kind of recourse do you seek from them? Sheryl Sandberg actually changed her display picture to Narendra Modi when he was visiting. I mean, here is a leader who is kind of amplifying Hindu majoritarian politics and religious polarization in India. I think in Indian context, Twitter and Facebook are actually aiding and amplifying the kind of hate against Muslims that we have not witnessed in decades in India, which has happened in the last 5 years. It's not just about my case, but everybody in India who's been complaining about rape threats and death threats. There has been no response. The first thing that Facebook and Twitter need to do is to acknowledge that there is a problem. When you do not acknowledge there is a problem, you will not come to a solution. And all social media organizations really need to take that responsibility. I do not see that, and as Narendra Modi is also to return to power in 2019 again, I really don't know what future lies for India and social media, including Facebook and Twitter, and the way not just journalists but activists and people who are dissenting will be targeted.
I'd sure like to know more about what Facebook is doing in India and what sort of assistance it continues to provide for Modi. We also know that Cambridge Analytica was involved in supporting him back, in his initial run. And I think, it seems to me also that the lack of transparency leads to this lack of accountability. Caroline, I want to go to you. What do you think the platforms can or should do? At one point you mentioned that you doubted that Facebook even had any Maltese commentators and that a lot of this was happening in the local language.
I think that first of all, they have to stop considering themselves as a neutral carrier, but accept the responsibility of a publisher. With all the fact-checking, the verification that every editor has to go through before anything is published, and face the liability as any other editor or publisher does when they fail at that. On a state level, recently the UK Parliament published an extensive report, it's the Damien Collins report on disinformation and fake news. And while they talk, there's a number of strong recommendations there. They include also looking at electoral laws on state level to address this micro-targeting and the maneuvering and shifting of votes through misinformation and disinformation. And I think that we as journalists need to show more solidarity and overcome the limitations that we are facing by coming together and publishing and supporting the challenges that we're all facing in different parts of the world.
Great. Okay, who has a mic? Great. Please do ask a question, keep it brief, and then we'll go to a second person. So make sure there's a second person with a question. We'll take two at a time.
Good morning. I'm a Brazilian journalist and I run a weekly magazine, political magazine there. And as you know, the country just elected a man a military who thinks dictatorship, who celebrates dictatorship, who is surrounded by militaries too, and who thinks media is the enemy of the world too. So for you guys, what were the first signs of things would end up so badly for you, for example, because I think we are in the beginning of this path.
Scary, very important question. Who has the second mic? Was there a second question? Anyone? No? Okay, right here. I want to take two at a time just to make sure we only have 10 minutes.
Hey, thank you for the talk. I'd like to ask you, given how things have turned out for you with all the doxing, accusations, so on and so forth, is there anything that you would have done differently? And what's your thought on anonymity in journalism?
Excellent questions, thank you. I'm going to go down the row. So we've got a question about what were the first signs, what would you do differently, and what do you think about anonymity? Let's keep the answers short and sweet so we can do another round of questions. Again, raise your hands, get the mics to two people. Thank you.
Well, Turkey's switch to authoritarianism has been a slow motion process. So there were many signs. I think what we began with the Gezi Park protests in 2013 showed first test with the media, particularly television. Pay attention to television, because television in societies such as Brazilian, Russian, Turkish, Egyptian, Ukrainian, I think it's up to 85–90% of people get their information from television for free, mostly for free. And this was understood by Putin, by Erdogan, by other leaders, and they curbed television for the first thing. They cared less about the print press, which is fading. And online is basically, in terms of sociology in Turkish reality, it's urban areas, youth, etc., don't really touch, doesn't really reach the elderly. So this is one, the media. The second one is, I think, when you hear a lot of anti-women discourse, I think that's a very strong sign of things really turning nasty. I would stop that there, because I'm sure you'll have other things to say.
I've never spoken about Narendra Modi in isolation. I think Modi is a new norm of a new world order, whether it is Duterte or Erdogan or Trump or Putin or Bolsonaro for that matter. When did it start? I think it started when people of my country kind of developed amnesia of the Prime Minister's past, that he presided over a genocide and pretended it was normal. I think that's when you realize that it's only going to get worse, because when you do not care for the lives of those 1,000 people and you were othering them every day, I think the process started then. As far as the question of anonymity was, it is an important question. Till such time that I was an investigative journalist, with an organization when I went undercover, it went into my favor because my name is Rana. It's an Arabic word, but a lot of people in the country think it's a male word. So a lot of mails came for Mr. Ayyub, which went in my favor. But, and I did not have any social media accounts. But after my book, I had to basically, when the media decided to not cooperate with me, I had to be on television channels. I had to make myself very public on social media, because that's the only platform that you have to present yourself. So at some point, anonymity really is not an option for investigative journalists.
What about anonymity as helping to allow trolling?
You mean anonymous account? Well, I would rather tweet from my own account and say things that I want to say. I mean, at the risk of being trolled the way I am trolled.
Caroline, first signs, what would you do differently?
Well, we were actually shocked into it. Daphne was killed in a car bomb a few meters outside her home. It was a spectacle. It was a show intended to give a message, which is why we felt that we needed to react so strongly. Would I have done something different? What I would have done differently is support her more before this happened. And that's a lesson for all of us. In terms of anonymity, it's never an easy subject because, again, when you have people being targeted, one of the only ways in which they can stand up for themselves is by using that anonymity. I don't believe in journalists using that because your work and your credibility and your integrity are very much a result of your product is very much a result of that.
Thank you. All right, second round of questions. Who has a mic? Anyone? Yes. Where are the mics? Can you get it to... Okay.
Beh, prima di tutto grazie per la vostra testimonianza. Non sono un esperto del settore, per cui le cose che avete detto da un certo punto di vista mettono un po' di disperazione perché in alcuni paesi sono compiute, in altri sembra che si stia iniziando. Da un certo punto di vista l'atteggiamento di questo, io lo chiamo trolling perché non ho capito l'altra parola, sono un po'... di come viene effettuato ricorda molto i metodi mafiosi, cioè nascondersi, non sapere chi è la sorgente, questo incute ancora più paura, ancora più efficacia alle cose che si fanno. Al di là del richiedere alle piattaforme di operare, mi sembrerebbe dal mio punto di vista che sia più efficace forse, perché le piattaforme sono cose private che hanno un loro scopo e che non penso possano sostituirsi alla politica e alle nazioni, sia di richiedere agli enti come l'Europa, come l'ONU, di potenziare delle agenzie efficaci di controllo su questi aspetti, che possano dare, qualora all'interno del paese non ci sia più neanche l'opposizione. Mi aveva colpito quanto ha detto Caroline prima, che dà supporto a chi vuole diffondere verità e fatti, che stimolino comunque o che mettano all'indice questo tipo di situazioni. Grazie.
Great, thank you. Okay, so basically, should there be third-party agencies such as the UN, the EU in charge to help exercise some control, skepticism over whether the platforms as private actors should do so? Caroline, start with you.
I'll refer back to the Damien Collins report because it's a very extensive study, and what it suggests is an independent regulator in combination with the other measures that it proposes. The idea is obviously we even in different regions of the world we don't quite see eye to eye in terms of government intervention. Some are more reluctant to have regulation. So the idea of an independent regulator, whether on a national level or some kind of international body, can, I think, help to offer some kind of protection to journalists.
Well, there are international, bodies which are there for protection of journalists, and they have been doing a decent job. But when you have governments which basically, when their only agenda is to spread hate politics, and when journalists are trying to spoil that, I don't really think that independent bodies will be able to make any headway. Like in our cases, the UN has intervened; it sends special rapporteurs to the government, and the government does nothing. It's brazening it out, and when the government brazens it out, I really don't know how much can independent regulators act or interfere in that.
And that's a perfect description of mafia. Analogy is perfect. In Turkish case, for example, I would just need to say that because there are known parts of the mafia, I would say, let's say, quote unquote, people, politicians, who we see, and they distribute jobs to the trigger man. hitmen, which are the trolls. So this is quite open pattern, and I'm sure you will see it in the Mediterranean basin, the same pattern. Regarding the sort of task force building is important, but I would say, maybe in a joking way, that with the trolling with the identities against the platforms, pressurizing, social pressure, that this trolling patterns should be really, blocked by these platforms is important. Social pressure is important from down up. I think that's necessary now, and that people should really mobilize themselves to have blocked, because it's getting to them.
Great, and since we just have a couple minutes before we wrap up, I'm going to take moderator's privilege to answer that question from my own perspective. I have deep skepticism about the ability of the United Nations, for sure, to regulate anything related to the internet. I think that if you look at the world dynamics right now and how power works in the United Nations, I would be very skeptical of putting that type of decision there, where you have very powerful countries like China and Russia who have very little interest in independent journalism or freedom of the press. With respect to the European Union, I think it's challenging to have a regulator to really understand what the deep issues are. And so thinking about regulation, not on content. I think it's very difficult to regulate content. But you can look at behaviors, and I think looking at privacy and how you can protect user data has a lot of promise for further regulation as a way to control some of the opportunities that exist on these platforms to do organized trolling campaigns or targeted trolling campaigns and disinformation campaigns. Because if you're not able to, for example, create these massive profiles of individual users where you can narrow down to very specifics, white nationalists who hate Jews and want to target them with your ad, it's going to make it harder for some of these agendas to spread. Similarly, if you can look at, get away from the speech paradigm to think about trolling and think about the behavior paradigm, that should cause less concern, because I think that we've seen very, very, I think, mixed and poor results with the ability of states to regulate speech. So let's look at behaviors, let's look at privacy as the flip side of freedom of expression. So with that, could you please join me in thanking these journalists for sharing their perspective, which is also a traumatic event when you're going through the type of experiences that they've had. Thank you for your reporting. Thank you for bringing all of these issues to life. Please join me in thanking them. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful panel.
Sof?
Hi.